Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be kind of sort of looking at the T-14 Armata, but also kind of not. Now, part of the reason for this video was that some of the discussion around the T-14 Armata started up again. However, it was kind of becoming a bit of a response chain between some YouTubers, and I wasn't really interested in getting involved, so I was going to hold off until all of that died down. And then they started releasing hour-long response videos to hour-long response videos to hour-long response videos to an hour-long video, and honestly, that's just a complete mess. It's the YouTube equivalent of a snake eating its own tail, and honestly, it's just getting very stupid. The best video I could recommend, because most of them have lost a lot of their focus on content very rapidly, is the video by Nicholas Moran, aka the Chieftan, where he neatly summarizes it in about 10 minutes or so and also offers some interesting insights. So if you are interested in all of this stuff going on with that, that's kind of the only video I would really recommend looking at. However, I did kind of want to add at least a little bit of my own input on tanks in general and the T-14 Armata specifically, and a lot of how the internet kind of treats tanks, especially the tank enthusiast kind of community on the internet. And of course, you're probably asking, what are my qualifications? Well, as you can probably guess about my video about handling classified information, I was in US Army Military Intelligence. You can also tell by the boomer camo that it has been a minute, but yes, that was my job at one point in time. And you're probably thinking, well, US Army Intelligence, this guy's probably going to spill some intel because this is also a War Thunder channel. Actually, no, and this is kind of one of the salient points that I wanted to get to right off the bat. So it turns out specific stats such as a vehicle's exact armor value in millimeters or a shell's exact penetration in millimeters are not really a factor in terms of large-scale strategic planning. In this respect, what you're really looking at, and the characteristic that I had to look at the most, was does the vehicle have nods or night observation devices, and does the vehicle have thermal imaging? Obviously, if your enemy can't operate effectively in low light conditions, but you can, that presents a pretty big advantage to you, and that does directly affect operational planning. It can change when and how you want to launch your assaults. However, a lot of the other characteristics that tank communities like to just emphasize just aren't that much of a factor when you're doing large-scale planning. To piggyback off that point, for anybody here who's not familiar with phase lines, which is probably most people watching this video because phase lines are kind of boring, phase lines are the way you plan the progress of a unit or the expected progress of a unit over the course of an operation. So you would have D-Day, which is the day the operation is taking place, and H-Hour, which is the hour the operation is taking place. And if you're doing smaller scales, the phase lines would go H+1, which is the first hour after the operations take place, and that phase line would represent the progress of the formation, and then you'd have H+2, which is the phase line for the second hour of the operation, and so on and so forth, to kind of map the progress of a unit over time. And if you zoom out a little, you would start doing the D phase lines for D+1, D+2, same thing the first or second day after the operation, and this can go on for a while. There are technically like H-1 and D-1, but these are more like planning milestones for like the lead up to an operation rather than something you would actually mark on a tactical map. Now, when you're doing phase lines, the number one factor is the mobility type of the formation. So for example, a tracked formation, regardless of what tank, it could be a T-14 Armata, an Abrams, a T-72, an M60, all tracked formations are broadly assumed to use the same mobility. The reason for this is a formation always moves at the speed of the slowest vehicle in that formation. So while yes, an Abrams brigade would have Abrams, it would also have IFVs like Bradleys, it would also have air defense systems, it would also have self-propelled artillery like the M109 Paladin. So the formation is moving at the slowest speed of any of these vehicles, but you're still not using the max speed. You're using like road march speeds effectively, and that's even if you're on the march. If you're meeting contact, your speed would be even slower because phase lines are influenced by things like terrain, enemy resistance, blah 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 blah. So at the end of the day, what all of this really translates to is that if you're looking at an overlay on a tactical map, all of these units, basically no matter what type of tank they're equipped with, will be plotted as an oval, either in a blue rectangle or in a red diamond. There's not really a lot of differentiation among vehicles, although you would obviously annotate the unit and you would hopefully have orders of battle on hand so you could consult it to see what exactly equipment that unit was equipped with. Like the actual type of equipment wouldn't influence the symbology and wouldn't necessarily influence the planning process. Your success is much more likely to be determined by numbers, combined arms, communication and coordination of different elements, all that good stuff. So overall, this is why debating individual tank stats gets very, gets very academic, because when you look at the effectiveness of, like, say, a Sherman tank formation and a Panther tank formation, there's not a huge difference, even though the Panther should technically outclass the Sherman. However, moving on to more like T-14 Armata specific points, my general analysis and assessment of the Russian military has always been that its eyes are a little bigger than its wallet. The Russian military wants an army that is both advanced and large. However, they have the budget for a military that is either advanced or large. They can't really do both. But there's also a bit of a problem with that, in that the Russian military also has a lot of territory it has to defend. So they can't not have a large military unless they just want to leave large swaths of territory undefended. And this puts them in an odd situation, because they want to advance and they want to move forward, but they've never really had the funding to do it ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this has also led to a scenario where very few projects go from inception to reality unless it is heavily based on a Soviet era platform, because those are the easiest ones that they can put into production in relatively large numbers. And even then, to an extent, they haven't truly standardized on a lot of these platforms. There's still more variety than there probably needs to be. And this mostly has to do with the Soviet system, where you had different plants producing different types of equipment, which was kind of unnecessary, but also creates a scenario where completely retooling the plant would be very expensive. So it's important to understand these kind of budgetary limitations. And to use some prime examples, the Admiral Kuznetsov, the only operational Russian aircraft carrier, and operational is pretty generous in that statement, because it spends most of its time either in dry dock or on fire. Obviously, the Russian military would love to have an operational carrier that could put to sea with a full air wing, but they simply can't afford to maintain and repair this aircraft carrier. And of course, rolling into another example, the average flight hours of Russian pilots was around 90 to 100. Generally, 100 is the minimum for a pilot to be able to take off and land successfully and perform a single mission with a good degree of proficiency. If you wanted your aircraft to perform a lot of different mission types, such as air-to-air, air-to-ground, or really complex mission types like SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense, you actually need a lot more flight hours than the Russian military has allocated. And this is probably part of the reason why in the ongoing conflict the Russian military hasn't really proven capable of adequately suppressing hostile air defenses, but that's kind of another story. And all of this paints the picture of a military that, while it has the technical capacity to design and produce individually advanced platforms, the budget doesn't actually allow those platforms to see service in any kind of meaningful numbers. And this means that any advanced platform that is put into service will always be diluted in terms of effectiveness by all of the other, like, outdated platforms next to it that, while still competent, don't offer the same level of potential advantages. And of course, this also rolls into things like material scarcity. So prior to all of the embargoes, Russian Federation imported around 99% of its silicon. Silicon is obviously used in the manufacture of microchips. And obviously, microchips on the modern battlefield is increasingly getting to be a commodity. Modern systems need these to function. And if you're heavily reliant on other nations, any scenario where you're in an embargo or you're at war with major suppliers, now you have to find other sources of that material, or you have to do a lot of triaging of your needs of that material. To use a classical example, in World War II, the United States had to choose between tungsten to manufacture machine tools to help the manufacturing process and build more pieces of equipment, or tungsten for high-velocity armor-piercing ammo. Ultimately, they leaned on the machine tools, and this did allow vehicles to produce in higher capacities, but it also meant that the Sherman tank took a lot longer than it should have to get HVAP rounds into service and out to tank crews. And of course, this is a triaging of needs. This is something every country that is, when it's in a war where resources are scarce, they have to do. So when you start having to triage microchip needs, is the Russian military going to feel that the T-14 Armata presents enough of an advantage, despite the fact that it requires a disproportionately large amount compared to something like a T-72B3 or a T-80 BVM, for the Russian military to keep it in production? Or are they simply going to triage it to produce more of these older model tanks to suit the immediate needs? And I was always kind of skeptical that they would lean on the Armata side. Both the cost of the platforms, the technical requirements of the platforms, and the number of microchips required of the platforms all kind of pointed towards me, when I saw the Armata, that you would maybe get a unit of these on the battlefield, but then replacement parts and replacement vehicles would be unobtainium. So those advanced tanks would just slowly get rotated out for more primitive models that were easier to mass produce and that parts were more readily available for. And of course, that might be a misread on my part, but I think based on the situation in the current conflict, I don't think it was completely off base to assume that simplicity would win out over complexity, especially when you started having those resource shortages and you started fighting a large enough conflict. Now, you've probably noticed up to this point in the video, I haven't really talked about whether I think the Armata can do everything the Russian military claims it can do, or whether or not it has a specific type of engine, or whatever tedious details, because at this point, it kind of doesn't matter. This program has been going on for around 10 years. We have visually confirmed about a company of Armatas, and at the current rate of production, it doesn't even look like they've hit full rate production, like we're not seeing any kind of large scale amping up of production. It would probably be a decade or more before we would even see a single brigade of them enter service. The current company of Armata doesn't even have operational status. If you're curious, like, operational is, everybody's trained on it, everybody's trained on routine maintenance tasks, we have all this stuff planned out, we have an ample supply of certain parts, blah, blah, blah. Like, we've worked out all the kinks and we can put this on the field and operate it. The current Armatas do not have, last time I checked, operational status. And the Russian military claimed that it sent Armatas to Ukraine, and then shortly thereafter claimed that it withdrew them from Ukraine. Now, that claim has to be taken with a grain of salt. Ukraine is currently one of the most photographed and videotaped conflicts in history, and apparently nobody took out their smartphone or camera to record these vehicles, so has to be viewed with some level of skepticism. But even if they were deployed and withdrawn, there was no other word about what they did. So either they weren't deployed there at all, or they were sent there and did so little remarkable that nobody thought to comment on it, and I will leave it up to the viewers to which one you think is true and which one you think is worse. But this does raise a very obvious issue with the T-14 Armata in that the program is moving impossibly slow right now. It simply isn't receiving the funding it needed. It likely received the double whammy from the war in Ukraine that a lot of programs in the United States received with the war in Iraq. That is to say, the immediate needs of the conflict are superseding funding for potential developmental projects. A lot of US developmental projects were canceled during the war in Iraq to meet the immediate needs of that conflict. Additionally, the war in Ukraine has also spurred a lot of Western nations to start looking at introducing their own next-generation main battle tanks. Now, you can say whatever you want about the technology level of the Armata, but even if it does everything as intended, all of these Western main battle tanks that are being looked at for development right now have had basically 10 years of additional technological development, which means that when they roll off the assembly line, assuming any of them do within the next probably 5 to 10 years, it's safe to assume they will be at least as good, if not better, than an Armata. And this creates a major challenge for the Armata because from a funding standpoint, the Armata was built on the promise of technology, and you only have a specific window to get that technology to the battlefield before it is no longer impressive. And if you haven't hit full rate production by then, which in turn reduces the cost per unit of the vehicle, now you're just paying a lot more money to get a worse product. So the Armata kind of has a bit of a ticking clock right now, because unless the Armata, whatever is wrong with it, whether it be technical funding or just the political will to see the project through, who knows, who cares, unless those problems can be resolved, the Armata is kind of an irrelevant vehicle. It's just going to fade into relative obscurity because it's just not going to see any major use or service. It will get to the point where it doesn't make any financial sense to even continue the program, and it will just be reduced to parade fodder and nothing else. And that has to be my kind of final assessment on the Armata is the arena system could work perfectly as advertised, the rest of the vehicle could work perfectly as advertised, but if the Russian military doesn't put money into it and get it on the battlefield, then it doesn't really matter. And if all they get is a single company, then that will never impact any conflict. Ultimately, I think the Armata has some interesting ideas. It would be academically interesting to know how the arena system compares something like the Israeli trophy system. The Israeli trophy has seen combat and has fared pretty well. The arena, I believe the Russians have looked at putting it on some other tanks. However, probably due to cost, maybe due to technical issues, it's hard to say. They haven't really followed through with it. And this isn't a surprise. The trophy system, despite being commercially available for a little while, hasn't seen widespread use because A, it's heavy, B, it takes up a lot of real estate on the vehicle, and C, it's expensive. So the arena could have similar issues. And of course, the crew capsule idea is something I very much think we'll be seeing again on Russian Federation vehicles, because The Russian Federation kind of follows a lot of old Soviet doctrine in terms of the crew having all of their hatches closed while in combat, and the difference between having your hatches closed while the crew is in the turret and having the hatches closed while it's in the hull is kind of an academic point. So I strongly suspect we will see that feature return on any new MBT designs they try to develop in the future. However, I'm not sure Western countries will be as keen on it, because a lot of Western tank commanders do like to poke their head out of the hatch to get greater awareness of their surroundings, and a lot of Western tank doctrine does emphasize individual commanders trying to get more awareness and take the initiative more. So whether or not that will translate as well to Western tanks, I'm not as confident, but we'll see. You never know. Overall, I think a lot of the argument about the Armata is like having an involved argument about Abrams X or the KF-51 Panther or the EMBT. Until we start seeing large-scale productions of this roll out, it's just an academic discussion. It's interesting, and that's it, and we probably shouldn't be throwing insults back and forth over it, but hey, what do I know? Anyway, I'm Rabbit. I hope you had a nice time. If you enjoyed this video, let me know down in the comments. I could try to do more like it. But this might just be a one-off. Have a nice day, everybody. Please like and subscribe.